Hello everyone, I'm Officer Cedric Loxley. Today, I want to tell you about something that happened to me while working as a police officer. I've been doing this job for 22 years. I've seen a lot. I've buried colleagues. I've watched neighborhoods burn and watched them come back sometimes. I've sat across from killers and I've sat across from grieving mothers. I've made arrests I was proud of and I've made mistakes I still think about at night. But there is one thing from my career, one person, that I think about more than anything else. And it's not the worst thing I ever saw. It's not the biggest arrest. It's not the night I nearly got shot on Delacroix Avenue. It's a man who stood behind a counter every day and quietly changed everything around him, while the rest of us barely noticed he was doing it at all. His name was Marcus Eberly. He ran a small grocery store on the corner of Hadley Street and 10th in a neighborhood called Crestline. And for the better part of 15 years, that man knew more about the criminal infrastructure of our city than most of the detectives I ever worked alongside. I'll get to how that's possible. I'll get to all of it. But I want to start at the beginning, because if you don't understand what Crestline was like in those early years, you won't understand what Marcus meant, and you won't understand why. When I finally found out the truth about him, I had to sit down on the curb outside the federal building and just breathe for a while. I was assigned to the Crestline district in the spring of 2003. I was 28 years old. I'd been on the force for 5 years, and I had asked for this assignment specifically. Some of my colleagues thought I was crazy. My training officer, Sergeant Reeves, pulled me aside when the paperwork went through and told me, with all the warmth of a man who had seen too many young officers make the same mistake, that Crestline would either make me or finish me. He said it the way you'd describe a stove to a child, not to scare me, just because he'd watched enough people touch the hot part. Crestline had been deteriorating for about a decade by the time I got there. It had been a working-class neighborhood, factory workers, shop owners, families who had lived there for 2 and 3 generations. Then the plant closures came in the 90s, and with the jobs went a lot of the stability. And with the stability came what always comes when people have nothing to protect themselves with. The gangs moved in, the drugs moved in, and the fear moved in right behind them. By 2003, there were 2 dominant organizations operating in Crestline. The first was a street gang called 6th Ward, named for the old city ward designation the neighborhood used to carry before redistricting. They controlled the eastern blocks, the apartment complexes along Faraday, and the corridors between Stanton Road and the elevated rail line. The second was a smaller but significantly more organized group called the Lanham Crew, which had roots in a family criminal enterprise going back to the late 80s. The Lanham Crew controlled distribution routes on the western end and had connections to suppliers outside the state that made them considerably more dangerous than their size suggested. These 2 organizations didn't get along. That's putting it mildly. In the 18 months before I arrived, there had been 11 homicides in Crestline directly connected to the rivalry between them. 4 of those victims were bystanders. One was a 14-year-old girl named Destiny Fowler, who was sitting on her front porch eating a popsicle when someone opened fire on a car parked 2 houses down. I read every incident report before my first shift. I wanted to know the street names, the player names, the geography of what I was walking into. I read about Destiny Fowler. I read her address. And on my first morning in Crestline, before I did anything else, I drove to that block and sat in my cruiser and looked at that porch and thought about what I was going to do. I had no illusions about being some kind of savior. I'd been a cop long enough to know the job doesn't work that way. But I remember thinking that the people living in that neighborhood deserved better than what they were getting, and that somewhere in the space between what I could do and what I couldn't, there had to be something worth trying. The first year was hard in the ways I expected, and a few ways I didn't. The expected parts were the drug calls, the disturbance calls, the domestic disputes that cycled through the same addresses every few weeks, the violent crime calls, the slow erosion that happens when you respond to the same crisis over and over and watch nothing change. You build professional distance. You have to. But it costs you something. The unexpected part was the community itself. I don't know what I thought Crestline was going to be. I suppose I had absorbed the same broad picture most people outside the neighborhood carried. A rough place, dangerous, people keeping their heads down. What I found instead were people who cared deeply about where they lived and were absolutely exhausted by what had been done to it. Parents who walked their kids to school along specific routes to avoid certain corners. Old men who swept their stoops every morning like an act of defiance. Church ladies who organized neighborhood watches with no support from anyone, who showed up to every community meeting even when nothing ever changed. And there were the small businesses, the barber on Stanton, the woman who ran a tailoring shop out of her first floor, the Haitian family with the restaurant on 10th, and then there was Eberle's. I first walked into Eberle's grocery probably 2 weeks into my assignment on a Tuesday morning in late April. It was a narrow store, the kind you don't see much anymore. Wooden floors that had been worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, shelves packed tightly with canned goods and dry staples and household products, a glass display case near the register with cold cuts and cheese, a small produce section near the back with a hand-lettered sign above it that said, "Fresh Today." The air smelled like coffee and something faintly floral, maybe a cleaning product, maybe just the building itself. Marcus was behind the counter. He was in his mid-50s at that point, a compact man, medium height, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He wore a canvas apron with the store's name on it, not printed, embroidered, which struck me as a choice. He was reading a newspaper when I came in, and he looked up and said, without missing a beat, "You must be the new one." I said I was. I said my name. He said his. He told me he'd been running the store for 21 years. He told me he'd seen 6 officers assigned to this stretch in that time, and that they were welcome in his store anytime, and that the coffee was fresh and he didn't charge officers for it, but that he would appreciate it if we didn't park the cruiser directly in front of the entrance because it made some customers nervous and he needed the business. I remember being surprised by how straightforwardly he said all of that. No flattery, no complaint, just a clear, sensible, neighborly transaction. I moved the cruiser. I took the coffee. And from that morning on, Eberle's was part of my routine. The thing about working the same beat for years is that it stops being a job and starts being a neighborhood. You learn the rhythms. You know which corner gets loud on Friday nights and which block is quiet even when it shouldn't be. You start to recognize faces the way you recognize people in your own town, not as subjects or potential problems, but just as people. The woman who jogs past the park every morning at 6:15, the old man with the lawnmower who is always somehow mowing the same small patch of grass, the teenagers who hang out behind the rec center and scatter when you drive past, and you know perfectly well they're not doing anything, they're just teenagers, but you slow down anyway because that's the job. Marcus Eberle became part of that rhythm. He was there when I started my shift, usually opening the store just after 6. He was there when I ended it if I finished before 7. He knew the names of most of his customers. He knew which families were struggling and would quietly let things run on a tab that never got paid, which he never mentioned to anyone. He stocked the brands that specific regulars wanted, even when ordering them was a hassle. He had a standing arrangement with the elementary school 2 blocks over to sell juice boxes and crackers at cost for field trips. When I think back on all of that now, all those small, careful acts of community, I understand them differently than I did at the time. At the time, I thought he was just a good man running a good store. Now I understand that Marcus had made himself essential to that neighborhood deliberately, comprehensively, and for reasons that went far beyond commerce. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first few years, my focus was on the street-level work, drug arrests, disturbance response, building relationships with residents who might be willing to talk. My partner at the time was a woman named Officer Dana Pruitt, who had been in Crestline for 3 years before me and knew the territory better than anyone I've worked with. Dana was patient and precise. She taught me which residents would talk and which ones wouldn't, and more importantly, she taught me to understand the difference between someone who was protecting a gang member and someone who was simply terrified of what would happen if they were seen talking to us. That distinction mattered. The gangs had constructed a very effective system of social control in Crestline. It wasn't just violence, though violence was certainly part of it. It was the constant, unspoken calculation that everyone in the neighborhood made every single day. What is the risk of this? If I say something, if I cooperate, if I let them see me talking to the police, what happens to me? What happens to my family? That calculation didn't favor us. It almost never did. We made arrests. We executed search warrants. We gathered evidence through surveillance and stopped vehicles and occasional buys using officers from the narcotics unit. We disrupted operations temporarily. We put people in jail who were back in the neighborhood within a year, sometimes less. The leadership of both organizations remained untouched. The distribution networks reconstituted themselves around whoever we'd removed. It was like, and I've used this analogy 100 times, so forgive me for using it again. It was like trying to bail out a sinking boat with a teacup. You're working as hard as you can. You're doing everything right, and the water keeps rising. I remember a conversation I had with Dana sometime around my 3rd year in Crestline. We were sitting in the car on Faraday Street after a call had gone sideways. A witness we'd been working to build a case had recanted, and we were both just sitting there absorbing it. Dana said to me, "You know what this place needs? Someone on the inside. Not a cop, not an informant they can identify, just someone who's part of the wallpaper, someone they don't think about." She wasn't talking about any specific person. She was just venting, but she wasn't wrong either. In 2006, Sergeant Reeves retired, and a detective named Earl Mackey came in to lead a new initiative aimed at building a longer-term investigative picture of both gangs. Mackey was from the organized crime unit, and he had a different approach than most of the people I'd worked with in patrol. He wasn't interested in individual arrests. He wanted to map the organizations, the leadership, the hierarchy, the financial flows, the supply chains. He called it building a ceiling to floor, meaning you understand the top first and work toward the ground level rather than arresting foot soldiers and hoping someone would talk. Mackey's approach required informants, not the kind we'd been using, street-level dealers who'd give up one person above them in exchange for a reduced charge, who were burned in 6 months and then useless, or worse. He wanted someone with sustained access, someone who moved through the community naturally, someone the gang members didn't clock. He didn't tell us at the time that he already had someone, or rather that someone already had him. I found that out much later. At the time, I was assigned as one of Mackey's patrol liaisons, which basically meant I fed him information from the street and assisted with surveillance and a few controlled buy operations. It was good work, more structured than what I'd been doing, but the pace was slow and the results were still frustratingly limited. Through all of this, my visits to Eberle's continued. Marcus had become, over those 3 years, something like a fixture in my day. Not a friend exactly. The professional distance kept us from that. But something genuinely warm. He asked about my family once I mentioned I had gotten married. He remembered my wife's name. When I told him we were expecting a child, he gave me a small paper bag with a card in it and a box of shortbread cookies he said his mother used to make when someone had good news. I still have the card somewhere. He talked about the neighborhood in a way that was neither angry nor resigned. He had a kind of measured affection for it, a clear-eyed love that acknowledged the pain without being consumed by it. He would talk about families he'd known for decades. He remembered when certain buildings had been hardware stores or pharmacies or bakeries. He knew the histories of houses and lots the same way some people know the histories of great buildings or national parks. Sometimes, early in the morning when the store was quiet, we would just talk about the neighborhood, about the things that had changed and the things that hadn't, about the kids he'd seen grow up and what they'd become, the ones who'd gotten out and the ones who hadn't. He never talked about the gang members or the drug activity directly. He never offered information, and I never pressed him for it. That wasn't what those conversations were. They were just two people sharing coffee in a quiet store before the day started. I understand now that those conversations had another dimension entirely. But at the time, they were just conversations. In 2008, something shifted. The Lanham crew brought in new product, a fentanyl-laced mixture that started showing up in the Western Corridor. And within 6 weeks, we had 4 overdose deaths. One of them was a 17-year-old named Tyrone Watts, who had been in Marcus's store buying a soda 48 hours before he died. I know that because Marcus told me. He said it quietly, without elaboration. He said, "That boy Tyrone was in here Thursday, got a Sprite and some chips." And then he looked at me for a moment and looked back down at his newspaper. That was all he said. But the way he said it stayed with me. The overdoses triggered a response from the department that was more coordinated than anything I'd seen in Crestline before. Mackey's task force was expanded. The city brought in additional resources from the State Narcotics Bureau. There were joint briefings and a new operational tempo. The chief of police was in Mackey's office twice in 1 week, which never happened. And then, about 3 months into this new initiative, we got a wiretap authorization. That meant we had established enough probable cause to intercept communications. It was a significant step. Wires are labor-intensive and legally demanding, and you don't get them without a substantial evidentiary foundation. I asked Mackey where the foundation had come from. He was careful about his answer. He said there was a source, a protected source, who had been providing information to the unit for several years. He said the source was deeply embedded in the community and that their identity was protected for extremely serious reasons. I didn't push. Informant identities are protected for good reason. People's lives depend on it. But I was curious. The information that had supported the wiretap application was detailed in a way that suggested either surveillance we hadn't conducted or access we didn't have. It described a meeting between Lanham crew leadership and an out-of-state supplier with specific details about the location, the time, who was present, and what was discussed. Nobody on our team had eyes on that meeting, and yet someone had. The wiretap produced results over the following 3 months that were genuinely remarkable. We were hearing conversations that mapped the organization's structure in real time. Names, relationships, money flows, stash locations. Mackey's ceiling-to-floor methodology was working for the first time in a way that felt real, but the wire had limits. Gang members were careful. They used coded language. They switched phones. They held sensitive conversations in person, in places we couldn't reach. There were gaps in what we were hearing, and those gaps often appeared at the most important moments. What filled some of those gaps? What I didn't know at the time was Marcus. I need to stop here and explain what I've come to understand about how Marcus operated, because it seems almost impossible if you try to think about it as a deliberate, designed thing. It wasn't designed. Not exactly. It grew. And it grew because of who Marcus was and where he stood in that community. A grocery store is a confessional. I mean that. People talk in grocery stores in ways they don't talk anywhere else. They talk to the person behind the counter not because they've decided to share something, but because they're comfortable, because they're not paying attention, because they're in the middle of an ordinary transaction and their guard is completely down. Marcus understood that. He had understood it for years. He didn't ask questions. That was the crucial thing. He never, ever asked questions. He listened. He remembered. He filed things away. And because he never asked, because he was just there, the way the counter was there, and the shelves were there, and the ceiling was there, people spoke freely. Gang members came into Eberle's. Of course they did. Everybody came into Eberle's. It was the only grocery store within 6 blocks. They bought food and cigarettes and phone chargers and beer. They stood around the counter and talked to each other the way people talk when they think they're invisible. They complained about people who had crossed them. They discussed business in vague but revelatory terms. They name-dropped. They bragged. They argued. And Marcus listened. The associates came in too. The women who were connected to gang members through relationships who knew more about the operation than any of the men would have guessed, because women always know more than men think they do. The younger kids who ran messages and kept lookout and wanted desperately to be seen as part of something. The peripherally connected, the people who weren't in the gang but had cousins or neighbors or clients who were, and who talked about what they knew because it made them feel important. All of that flowed through Eberle's, and Marcus absorbed it all. He had been working with the Federal Drug Enforcement Task Force since 2001, 2 years before I even arrived in Crestline. His handler, a DEA agent named Simmons, who I would eventually meet, had recruited him after Marcus had independently approached the federal prosecutor's office with information about an early Lanham crew distribution operation. Simmons had recognized immediately what Marcus represented. Not just a one-time source, but a long-term asset of extraordinary value. He put a structure around him, a secure communication protocol, a small stipend that Marcus almost never accepted, regular meetings conducted through layers of operational security that would have impressed a foreign intelligence service. Marcus had agreed to all of it without hesitation. Simmons told me later that he'd never had a source who asked less and contributed more. When Simmons asked him why he was doing it, Marcus had said, and Simmons remembered this word for word because it struck him so hard. Marcus had said, "I've watched this neighborhood get eaten alive for 20 years. I'm not leaving and I'm not giving up, so this is what I can do." That was it. No complex motivation, no grudge against the gangs, no personal loss he was avenging, though God knows he'd had losses. His nephew had died of a drug overdose in 1999, which I learned about only after all of this was over. He had simply decided that the store he'd built and the community around it were worth fighting for, and that this was the weapon available to him. I want to sit with that for a moment. Because it would be easy to make Marcus sound like some kind of hero in a movie. Simple, noble, tireless. But he wasn't a character in a movie. He was a man who was afraid. He was a man who understood exactly what would happen to him if the gangs figured out what he was doing. He was a man who, according to Simmons, occasionally called the emergency protocol number in the middle of the night, not because anything had gone wrong, but because he'd had a nightmare. He would call, say he was fine, say it was nothing, and hang up. Simmons told me those calls broke his heart a little every time. He did it anyway. For 15 years, he did it anyway. I found out in the fall of 2009. I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because the way you find out something like that matters. Mackey had called a small meeting. Me, Dana Pruitt, two detectives from the organized crime unit, and a federal agent I hadn't met before named Carla Voss. Carla was with the FBI, and she had been coordinating with the DEA operation that overlapped with ours in the Crestline territory. The meeting was about the next operational phase, a planned series of coordinated arrests that would target the Lanham Crew mid-level structure. Toward the end of the meeting, Carla mentioned the source. She said the source had provided confirmation on 3 of the 4 targets we were discussing, and that the source had indicated one of them was aware of increased law enforcement attention and might move sooner than we expected. Mackey nodded and said he understood and would adjust the timeline. I said, almost without thinking, how solid is this source? How long have they been active? Carla and Mackey exchanged a look. Not a long look, just a glance, the kind that means we need to make a decision right now without talking about it. Mackey said, long enough that I trust the information completely. That's as much as you need to know. I let it go. But that evening, after the meeting, Carla Voss caught up with me in the parking lot. She said, Mackey speaks highly of you. He says you've been in that neighborhood longer than anyone on the team. I said that was right. She said, do you know a store on the corner of Hadley and 10th? And something happened to me that I cannot entirely explain. I felt, I don't know exactly how to describe it, a kind of drop, like when an elevator moves faster than you're ready for. Not dread exactly, not recognition exactly, just a sudden, very specific, weightless feeling. I said I knew the store. Carla said, I can't tell you more than this right now, and I may not be authorized to tell you this much. But if you're going to be part of the next phase, you should understand something about the neighborhood you're working in. The person who has kept us most informed about Crestline for the past several years is someone who you've probably spoken to recently. I stood there in that parking lot in the October dark and I thought about the coffee and the newspaper and the shortbread cookies and the way Marcus had looked at me when he said that Tyrone Watts had been in the store 2 days before he died. I said, is it Marcus Eberly? Carla didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to recommend to Mackey that you be read in fully, because I think you being involved going forward is going to be important, and I think you need to understand what you're working with. She walked to her car. I stood in the parking lot for another 10 minutes, and then I sat down on the curb and just breathed. The full briefing happened 2 days later. Simmons flew in from the regional office. It was Simmons, Carla Voss, Mackey, and me, in a secure conference room at the Federal Building downtown. Simmons walked me through the entire history, the first contact in 2001, the recruitment, the operational protocols, the information flow over 8 years. He laid out in summary form the contributions Marcus had made to active investigations, the number of cases that had relied on information he'd provided directly or indirectly, the arrests, the convictions, the operations that had been confirmed or redirected based on what he'd heard across his counter. I didn't say much. I asked a few clarifying questions. I was working very hard to simply absorb what I was hearing without letting what I was feeling interfere with the process. After the briefing, Simmons asked me if I had any concerns about working directly with Marcus going forward. The plan was that I would become his primary local law enforcement contact, his day-to-day liaison who could respond quickly if something came up that required immediate police presence. Simmons would remain his federal handler, but my role would be to provide local coverage and continuity. I said I didn't have concerns. I said I was grateful for the trust. Simmons looked at me for a moment and said, he knows you. He trusts you. That matters more than you might think, because Marcus is careful about who he trusts, and he's been careful for a long time. Don't give him a reason to doubt his instincts. I said I wouldn't. The first time I went to see Marcus after the briefing, I went in the morning, just like always. I bought a coffee. I stood at the counter. There were a couple of customers in the back of the store. Marcus looked at me over his reading glasses and said, you look like you didn't sleep. I said I'd had a long couple of days. He said, He poured himself a coffee and leaned on the counter. He said, Mackey's team called me last night. I said I knew. He nodded slowly. He looked out the front window at the street. He said, I was wondering when they'd bring you in. I actually suggested it a while ago. Simmons said he'd consider it. I said, you suggested me? He said, you've been here 6 years. You know this neighborhood. You care about the people in it, which not every officer who comes through here does. And you're careful. I've watched you be careful." He paused. "That matters in this work." He said it so simply. This work. As if we were colleagues comparing notes on a shared project. As if he hadn't been risking his life for nearly a decade, alone, in a store on a corner that the gangs knew as well as he did. I wanted to ask him 100 questions right then. I wanted to understand the whole of it, how he'd lived with it, what it had cost him, what he was afraid of. But there were customers in the store, and Marcus was already turning to help one of them, and the morning was underway. There would be time. I thought there would be time. The months that followed were unlike anything else in my career. I was living a split existence. Patrol officer on the surface, which meant the same rounds and calls and daily rhythms I'd had for years, and liaison to the most sensitive, ongoing investigation in the district on a deeper level that almost no one knew about. Marcus and I developed our own communication protocol on top of what he had with Simmons. Simple, low-tech, exactly the way he liked it. If I came into the store and he had something for me, there was a particular way he'd arrange a small display of canned goods near the register. A subtle, innocuous shift that I learned to read without acknowledging. When I saw it, I'd come back at a specific time when the store was quiet, and we'd talk briefly, coded and careful. If he needed to reach me urgently, there was a relay through Mackey's office. We also talked sometimes, just as we always had. Just two people who'd known each other for a while, sharing the morning. I think that was the most important thing. That nothing about our surface relationship changed, because changing it would have introduced a new variable that people might notice. Marcus had survived this long partly by being utterly consistent. The store looked the same, smelled the same, opened and closed at the same times. He wore the same apron. He had the same conversations. He was the same man in every observable way. Over time, he began to explain to me how he did what he did, not in long, deliberate sessions, but in small pieces, over weeks and months, the way you learn a neighborhood by walking it rather than studying a map. He said the most important thing he'd ever learned was that people don't feel observed when they're in a familiar place. The men who came into his store had been coming in since they were teenagers in some cases. The store was as ordinary to them as their own kitchen. They weren't on guard there. They weren't performing for anyone. They were just buying cigarettes and energy drinks and talking the way people talk when they think nobody's really listening. He said the second most important thing was patience. He said you can't go looking for information. The moment you go looking, you've changed who you are, and people sense that. You have to wait for it. You have to be so genuinely present in what you're doing that the information just comes to you, the way water finds a path. He said he'd made a mistake once, early on, when he'd tried to steer a conversation. He'd been curious about a meeting he'd heard mentioned, and he'd asked a follow-up question, something casual, seemingly innocent, and the man he'd been talking to had paused just briefly and looked at him. Not with suspicion exactly, just with a kind of assessment. Marcus said he'd felt ice go through him. He'd recovered, changed the subject, acted completely normal, and nothing had come of it. But he'd never tried to steer a conversation again. Never. He said, "These men are not stupid. They have survived by reading people. You don't ask. You just wait." He had waited for 9 years. 9 years. By 2010, the investigation had reached a stage that Mackey called critical mass. We had enough information from The Wire, from Marcus, from surveillance operations and controlled buys and financial records to begin moving toward a comprehensive indictment of the Lanham Crew's upper tier. The challenge was timing. An operation like that is like a house of cards. Everything has to come down at once because if any one element tips before the others are ready, the whole structure collapses. People scatter, evidence disappears, witnesses recant, suspects lawyered up and relocated. We were targeting 7 individuals. The top of the Lanham Crew's hierarchy in the district. The men who made decisions about product, money, enforcement. If we could take all 7 simultaneously, we'd have a chance at a prosecution that could actually stick. Not just this level, but through cooperation agreements and the evidence chain we'd built, potentially the level above them as well. During this planning phase, Marcus was providing information that was, in some ways, the most detailed and valuable of his entire tenure, because the Lanham Crew was beginning to sense something. Not anything specific, not Marcus, but The Wire had made them more cautious generally, and the increase in law enforcement activity had put them on edge. They were meeting more frequently, adjusting their operations, testing people within their organization. Marcus heard all of it. He heard the paranoia and the strategy sessions and the contingency planning. He heard who was being suspected of disloyalty and why. He heard about a planned violence action against someone who had apparently been seen talking to police, a man named Deshaun Curry who delivered to a laundromat in the Eastern Corridor and who had, in fact, given us nothing, but who had the misfortune of being seen near our building and having enemies within the crew who were looking for a pretext. We moved on that immediately. We warned Curry through an indirect channel, and he relocated. We didn't tell him where the warning had come from. We couldn't. Marcus told me about that conversation afterward. He said he had heard two of the Lanham Crew's enforcers discussing Curry over a bottle of water and a bag of chips, standing 6 feet from where he was stocking a shelf, not even bothering to lower their voices because the store owner was just part of the furniture. He said the casualness of it, the way they talked about destroying a man's life between sips of water, had stayed with him. There was another thing he told me, which I've thought about many times since. He said that a significant portion of what he passed along was not intelligence in the sense of plans and operations and specific criminal acts. It was context. It was the texture of what was happening in the organization, who was angry at whom, who was trusted and who wasn't, who was using their own product, who had a new girlfriend whose brother worked somewhere important, who was getting ambitious above their station. That texture was often the difference between intelligence that was useful and intelligence that was just data. He said that investigators tend to think of information as facts. He said facts are the easy part. Facts are just what happened. What matters is the web around the facts, the relationships, intentions, and histories that explain why something happened and predict what happens next. He said, "I'm not a detective. I can't analyze what I hear, but I can hear everything, and you can analyze it." That division of labor, his ears, our analysis, was exactly what made him so valuable and so impossible to replicate. You could not have put an undercover officer in that store and achieved the same thing. An undercover officer is a performance. Sooner or later, something about the performance is wrong, and these men who had spent their adult lives reading people for survival would have felt the wrongness before they could identify it. Marcus wasn't performing, wasn't. He had been himself in his own store, among his own neighbors for 39 years. There was nothing wrong to feel. He said, "I've heard things in this store that I will never forget, things that have woken me up at night for 10 years. But I don't stop, because the minute I stop, somebody else gets hurt." I said, "You know they'd kill you if they found out." He said, "I know." I said, "You think about it?" He said, "I think about it every morning when I open up. I think about who might come in today and what I might hear and whether today is the day something changes." He looked at me steadily. "And then I put on my apron and I make the coffee and I open the door. Because what's the alternative?" I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. The operation date was set for a Thursday in March 2011. 7 arrest teams coordinated across 3 jurisdictions would move simultaneously at 6 in the morning. I was assigned to one of the teams, the group targeting a man named Calvin Ware, who ran the Lanham Crew's financial operations from a dry cleaning business on Marchetti Avenue. In the week before the operation, Mackey pulled me aside and told me that Marcus had flagged a concern. One of the targets, not Ware, but another man named Robeson, had apparently mentioned to someone in the store that he was planning to travel out of state the following weekend. It was a casual comment, the kind of thing you say without thinking. But it meant our window was narrowing on that particular target. We accelerated the timeline on Robeson's team. We didn't share why. We just said new intelligence suggested a shorter window. That was the kind of adjustment Marcus made possible. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. Not a last-second warning or a revelation that changes the whole operation. Just a small, precise piece of information that moved one gear a fraction of an inch in the right direction, and that fraction was the difference between an arrest and a fugitive. The morning of the operation, I drove past Eberle's on my way to the staging area. It was just before 5:30. The store was dark. Marcus didn't open until 6. I slowed down a little as I went past, looking at the darkened windows, the hand-lettered sign in the glass, the name Eberle's in faded paint above the door. I thought, he doesn't know today is the day. We hadn't told him. For security reasons, the final operational details had been kept within the arrest teams. He would hear about it like everyone else, on the news, from neighbors, from the people who came into his store that morning wondering what had happened. I pulled away from the curb and drove toward Marchetti Avenue. Calvin Ware was home when we arrived. He answered the door in a robe, and for a moment he simply looked at us, at the badges and the warrant and the small army of people on his porch, with an expression that was not panic and not anger, but something closer to exhaustion, like a man who had been waiting for this knock for a very long time and was almost relieved that the waiting was over. I've seen that expression before. It's one of the stranger things about this job. All 7 targets were in custody by 7:15. Nobody ran. Nobody resisted significantly. There were no injuries. The coordination between teams was almost exactly as planned, with minor variations that the teams absorbed and adjusted to. By 8 o'clock, Mackey was in the command post fielding calls from the U.S. Attorney's Office and looking like a man who hadn't slept in 6 months but had finally remembered what solid ground felt like. I drove back through Crestline after my team's arrest was complete. It was a little after 8. Eberle's was open. There were a few cars on Hadley Street that I didn't recognize. Probably press, probably neighbors from the far reaches of the district drawn by the news. I could see a small cluster of people on the corner across from the store, the way people gather when something has happened, and they're trying to understand what. I went in. Marcus was behind the counter. He was very still. There were 2 customers in the store, and I waited until they left. Then I stood at the counter and looked at him. He said, "I heard it on the radio." I said, "All 7, everyone we were targeting." He was quiet for a moment. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the counter very carefully and rubbed his face with both hands, slowly, the way a person does when they are trying to hold themselves together. He said, "How long did it take?" I said, 2 hours. He nodded. He picked up his glasses and put them back on. He said, "I've been waiting for something like this for a long time." I said, "So have I." He said, "Is it over?" I said, "No, but it's different now." He nodded again. He reached under the counter and took out the coffee pot and poured 2 cups and slid one across to me. We stood there in the quiet of his store and drank our coffee, and neither of us said anything for a while. And that silence was one of the most complete things I have ever felt. It wasn't over, of course. It's never over. The prosecution of the Lanham Crew's leadership played out over the following 2 years. There were delays, motions, continuances, plea negotiations, the grinding administrative machinery of the federal justice system doing what it does at the pace it does it. 3 of the 7 cooperated, which strengthened the case against the others and extended the reach of the investigation upward toward the out-of-state suppliers Mackey had always wanted to get to. Marcus testified. Not in open court, a protected deposition, sealed records, measures taken to prevent his identity from appearing in any publicly accessible document. Simmons sat with him through the whole process. Mackey attended. I attended. I watched Marcus sit across from a federal prosecutor and calmly, precisely, with the same quiet clarity I'd heard in the store 1,000 mornings, describe what he had heard and when and from whom he was an extraordinary witness. He remembered details that would have been difficult for a much younger man with a better night's sleep to retain. Dates, specific phrasing, context. The prosecutor asked him once how he was able to remember so specifically. Marcus thought about it for a moment. He said, "When you're listening to something that matters, you pay attention differently than you do when you're just being polite." 6th Ward, the other organization, began fragmenting in the wake of the Lanham Crew takedown. Some of that was organic. When one gang weakens significantly, the ecosystem around it shifts. Some of it was the result of a parallel investigation that had been building in the background of the Lanham Crew operation, using some of the same information and some different channels. By the end of 2012, Crestline was not a transformed neighborhood. I want to be honest about that because the easy version of this story ends with the gangs defeated and the neighborhood reborn and everyone living in sunlight. That's not what happened. Poverty doesn't evaporate because you arrest the men who are profiting from it. Trauma doesn't heal because the source of some of it has been removed. What did happen was a change in the atmosphere, the constant pressure, the ambient violence, the sense that certain blocks were territories that the rule of law did not govern. That eased. Not everywhere, not immediately, but perceptibly. The shooting statistics improved over 2012 and 2013 in ways that were measurable. The number of residents who came forward with information voluntarily, without the leverage of an arrest, increased. The elementary school that had been the site of a shooting in 2007 went 2 full years without a serious incident. Those are small things in the grand scale. They are enormous things if you live on those streets. Marcus continued running Eberle's. He had said from the beginning, during the Lanham Crew prosecution, that he had no intention of stopping and no intention of leaving. He said, "I've been in this store for 30 years. The people I've been protecting are still here. Why would I leave?" Simmons tried to relocate him after the Lanham crew convictions, not because there was a specific threat, but because the standard protocol called for it. Marcus declined with the gentle, immovable firmness that I had come to understand was one of the defining features of his character. He said he appreciated the concern. He said he would continue to follow the security protocols they had established. He said he was staying. Simmons told me later that he hadn't been surprised. He said, "Marcus is the only source I've ever had who made me feel like I was the one being protected." I think about that sometimes. What it cost Simmons to send a man home every day to a neighborhood where what he was doing could get him killed. What it cost Marcus to go home every night and come back every morning. What kind of faith in something has to be operating in a person to sustain that, year after year, in the absence of recognition, in the presence of constant risk? In 2015, there was a moment that I think about more than almost anything else from this whole story. A young man came into the store. I'll call him Marcus Jr., not his name, but a man who had grown up around the store, who had been a customer since he was a child, and who had spent the last several years working for what remained of the 6th Ward operation. He was 24, he had a record, he had been moving product on a small scale. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon, bought a sandwich from the deli case, and sat down in the small seating area Marcus had added in the mid-2000s. 3 tables near the window, a concession to the neighborhood's desire for a place to sit and eat without going far. He sat there for almost an hour. Marcus moved around the store. Other customers came and went. At some point, the young man, without looking up from his sandwich, said, "Marcus, do you ever think about getting out of here?" Marcus, who was sorting receipts at the counter, said, "Out of the store?" The young man said, "Out of the neighborhood, going somewhere else." Marcus said, "No." The young man said, "Why not?" Marcus looked at him for a moment. He said, "Because this is my place. The people here are my people. You don't leave your people." The young man was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've been thinking about getting out, not the neighborhood, my situation." Marcus said, "What's holding you back?" The young man said, "Fear." Marcus said, "Fear of them?" He said, "Fear of everything. What I'd be walking into, what they'd do, what happens to the people I'm responsible for." Marcus said, "The fear doesn't go away. You just decide whether it's going to be in charge of you." The young man sat with that. He finished his sandwich. He left. 2 weeks later, he went to the police. He cooperated in an investigation that dismantled what remained of the Eastern Corridor distribution network. He entered a relocation program. I found out about it from Mackie. I told Marcus. He was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I hope he's okay." I said, "He's safe." Marcus said, "Good." That was the whole conversation. No drama, no reflection on what he'd said or what it had meant. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something he'd cared about had turned out the way he'd hoped. In 2016, the DEA conducted a formal case review of the Crestline operations going back to 2001. Simmons was preparing to retire, and the review was, in part, his accounting of the 15 years he'd spent working the territory. The summary document, which I was allowed to read under protected circumstances, cited, in general terms, without identifying Marcus, the contributions of a confidential human source whose information had been a significant factor in 34 investigations, had contributed to 52 arrests, had helped prevent no fewer than 3 planned violent actions, and had provided material support to federal prosecutions resulting in approximately 200 years of combined prison time for individuals convicted of drug trafficking, conspiracy, and weapons offenses. 34 investigations, 15 years, 1 man, in a grocery store. I sat with that document for a long time. In the summer of 2017, Marcus had a health scare. His heart. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough that he had surgery and spent 3 weeks recovering. His daughter, he had a daughter in Atlanta, a nurse, a woman I'd never met, came to stay with him and manage the store during that time. I visited him at home. It was the first time I'd been to his house, which was 6 blocks from the store, a small, tidy bungalow with a garden in front that he'd planted himself. He was sitting on the porch when I arrived, moving slowly but sharp as ever. He said, "They tell me I have to slow down." I said, "That seems reasonable." He said, "What would that even look like?" I said, "Maybe closing the store an hour earlier." He thought about it. He said, "Maybe." We sat on the porch for a while. The neighborhood was quiet in the early evening. School was out, families were inside for dinner, and there was a particular kind of calm that had settled over Crestline in those years that still sometimes surprised me, having known it in harder times. He said, "Do you remember years ago you told me that the gang members would kill me if they found out?" I said I remembered. He said, "I've thought about that a lot over the years, not with fear exactly, more like respect for the weight of it, for what it meant to keep going anyway." I said, "Did it ever feel like it wasn't worth it?" He said, "Once, in 2008, after the overdoses, I came very close to not stopping exactly, but pulling back, going quiet. I was tired and I was scared, and I thought, maybe I've done enough. Maybe someone else can carry this now." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And then I thought about the people who would be coming into my store the next morning. The woman who works the early shift at the hospital and stops in for her coffee, the kids from the school, the old men who play chess on the corner. And I thought, they don't have the option of pulling back, so I don't either." He looked at me. He said, "That's not heroism. That's just deciding not to look the other way." I want to tell you about the morning I realized that what Marcus had done had rippled outward in ways that neither of us could fully map. It was 2018, and I was at a community meeting in the Crestline Rec Center, the kind of meeting they hold now sometimes where residents and police just talk, not about anything specific, just about the neighborhood and how it's going and what people need. A woman stood up. I recognized her from the neighborhood but didn't know her name, and she talked about how her son had started coming home from school without being afraid. She said she'd lived in Crestline for 24 years, and she couldn't remember a time before this when she sent her kid to school without the particular knot of dread in her stomach that goes with living in a neighborhood where violence is random and frequent. She said, "I don't know what changed. I don't know who did what. But something changed, and my son comes home safe, and I haven't had to pretend to be okay with less than that." I thought about Marcus, standing behind his counter, listening. I thought about the 15 years of small pieces of information, each one so seemingly minor, that had accumulated into this. A woman in a recreation center telling a room full of people that her son comes home safe. He would never hear that. He hadn't been at the meeting. Even if he had, she didn't know to thank him. Nobody in that room did, except me. Marcus retired from the Source relationship formally in 2019. At 68, with his heart condition and the changed landscape of Crestline, Simmons and the oversight team agreed that the operational necessity no longer justified the ongoing risk. There was a formal stand-down, a final debriefing, a documentation process that I won't describe in detail, but that was treated with the kind of care you give to a significant historical record. I was in the room for part of it. At the end, Simmons presented Marcus with a document, classified, not something Marcus could ever show to anyone or speak about publicly, acknowledging his service and the impact of his contributions. It had the official seal, it had Simmons' signature, and the signatures of 2 senior officials. Marcus looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He didn't say anything for a moment. Simmons said, "You've done something that very few people ever do. You should know that." Marcus said, "I ran a grocery store." Simmons said, "You did a great deal more than that." Marcus said, "No, I ran a grocery store. That's what I did. Everything else came from knowing the people in it." He shook hands with everyone in the room. He thanked them, briefly, with the same unpretentious directness he'd always had. And then he went back to Hadley Street and opened his store the next morning at 6 o'clock. In 2021, Eberle's celebrated its 50th anniversary, 50 years since Marcus's father had opened the store. Marcus had been running it for 39 of those years. The neighborhood threw a celebration, a block party basically, with a banner over the front of the store and food from the other businesses along Hadley and music from a speaker someone had put in the bed of a truck. Families came out, kids ran around on the closed-off street. I came in uniform because I was technically on shift, and I stood near the edge of the crowd and watched Marcus move through the celebration with the same unhurried grace he'd always had, talking to everyone, remembering everyone's names, pressing food and drinks on people who tried to leave too soon. An older woman, I believe she'd been shopping at the store since it was his father's, since she was a girl, held Marcus's hands and cried a little and said, "You've always been the heart of this block." Marcus said, "The block is the heart. I just opened the door." I thought about that. Standing there on the summer street with the music playing and the kids running and the smell of food and the sound of people who had survived something together and come out the other side, I thought about what it means to open a door between the inside and the outside, between what a neighborhood looks like from a distance and what it actually is when you live in it, between information and the ears that needed to hear it, between a community that was being consumed and the slow, painstaking 15-year effort to give it something different. Marcus had opened every one of those doors. I transferred out of Crestline in 2022, after almost 20 years in the district. It was a voluntary transfer, a supervisory position in another part of the city, an opportunity I'd wanted for a while. The morning I cleared out my patrol car for the last time and drove up Hadley Street on my last shift, I stopped in front of Eberle's. Marcus was in the window, arranging something in the display case. He looked up and saw me, and his face did something I hadn't seen it do very often over the years. It opened up like the word smile isn't quite sufficient for what his face did. It was something warmer and more complex than that. It was the look of someone who has been through a great deal with you and knows that you know the weight of it. He came to the door. He was in his late 60s now, a little slower, the gray hair fully white. He still wore the canvas apron. He said, "Last day?" I said, "Last day." He said, "You did good work here." I said, "We did." He considered that for a moment. Then he went back inside and came back with a paper bag. He said, "Shortbread, for the road." I took the bag. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't be insufficient, so I didn't try to say anything grand. I just said, "Take care of yourself." He said, "You too." I drove north out of Crestline with the bag of shortbread on the passenger seat. I've told this story a few times to people I trust, in contexts where I was able to tell it, and the question I get asked most often is some version of, what does it mean? What's the lesson? I'm not sure I have a lesson. I'm a police officer, not a philosopher, but I have a few things I've come to believe. I believe that the most important work that happens in a community rarely happens where you can see it. It happens in the small transactions, the morning conversations, the moments when someone chooses to pay attention rather than look away. It happens in the spaces between the large and dramatic events, in grocery stores and on front porches, and at school pickup lines, and in the 10 seconds when a person decides whether to trust someone. I believe that courage is almost never cinematic. Marcus Eberle was not dramatic. He did not make speeches. He did not brandish anything or stand up at any podiums. He put on an apron and opened a door and listened for 15 years with an attention and a discipline that most people in any profession never come close to. That was his courage. Quiet, daily, choosing the same thing over and over when each choice carried a cost that most people are never asked to pay. I believe that communities are held together by people who decide to stay when they could leave, to engage when they could disengage, to care when indifference would be so much easier. Marcus could have sold Eberle's a dozen times over. He had offers. He could have retired to Atlanta with his daughter. He could have, at any point in 15 years, told Simmons he was done and gone somewhere the gangs didn't know his name and lived a quieter life. He didn't. And the neighborhood is different because he didn't. I also believe, and this is the part I think about most, that trust is the most radical act available to most people. Marcus trusted us. He trusted a system that had, in many documented ways, failed the neighborhood he lived in and the communities like it all over the country. He trusted that what we were trying to do was worth helping. That trust was not naive. He was the most careful and perceptive man I've known. It was chosen. Deliberately, with clear eyes, in full knowledge of the risks. That's not the same as having faith in an institution. That's something harder. That's choosing to act toward a future you want to exist, even when the present gives you plenty of reasons to give up. Eberle's is still open. Marcus, as of the last time I checked in, was still behind the counter most mornings. Though his daughter manages the operations now and he does less of the physical work, the apron is still there, the coffee is still fresh, Crestline is not healed, no neighborhood that went through what that one went through is simply healed. There are still struggles, still crime, still families living with less than they deserve, but there is also, unmistakably, something that wasn't there when I arrived in 2003. A kind of equilibrium, a sense that the neighborhood belongs to the people who live in it, not to the organizations that were trying to take it over. I drove through there last spring. It was a morning, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been cleaned overnight. I drove past the school where the girl, Destiny Fowler, had lived, and there were kids out on the playground, loud and running. the way kids are when they haven't been taught to be afraid yet. I drove past Eberly's. It was open. I didn't stop. I just drove slowly and looked at the sign and the window and the light inside, and I thought about a man in a canvas apron and 30 years of coffee and everything he carried that nobody knew he was carrying. I thought about how we all live inside other people's quiet choices. How much of what we take for granted, the safety of a street, the character of a community, the small, ordinary freedoms of an ordinary day, is built on the unseen labor of people who decided, without recognition or reward, to give something they didn't have to give. Marcus gave that. He gave it every day for 15 years. That's what I wanted to tell you today. Thank you for listening.